Today I sit down with Zor athlete Sam Hagen and we talk through the Fittest experience events and our reflections about that. Enjoy. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com.
As a competition, right? TFX as a competition for competitive folks looking for events to put on their calendar. I had a great time and I recommend it, right? I was in RX Men and I thought it was a competitive field, kind of that like upper quarterfinals type level athlete, at least in my division. Everything was run smoothly and it was kind of a good mix of the events that they promised us, right? With a couple surprises.
Yeah, there's definitely some surprises and changes. And I think, as you know, I'm sure like more experienced athletes can probably attest to this more. Like it's common that things get switched in some form or fashion, or like it looks a certain way on paper and then doesn't actually like shake out that way. Like the games, it's a 5K, and it's like, oh, it's actually not 5K.
Right.
Whereas like there's always stuff like that where it wants to be like clean on paper, but then when you get into practices, it doesn't always run that way. Like for us, Texas got like hammered with a bunch of rain before we went down, so it was like, oh, it's a 2 mile run. It's like, well, it's actually a little over 2 miles, and then like for 800 meters of it, you're gonna be running through like 4 inches of really thick like clay mud, where it's like a soft sand run almost, where it's really hard to like create any traction at all. So like that kind of throws a wrench into what you're doing, but also like, that's almost what I like about in-person events, is that things don't always go according to like, plan or like how it's written down on paper exactly. And it's like, you kind of have to be adaptable and make the most of it, which is kind of cool.
Totally agree. I think just overall, it was a well-run competition with good energy, right? Good positive energy. There was kind of that right amount of tension in the air where everyone that is showing up to that comp is really trying, right? Because they had to qualify and the sport means something to them, right? But it's not so intense that it felt, suffocating or cutthroat, or at least, I wasn't in the pro division, but that was my impression.
No, and it's funny because like I think a lot of athletes are basically there to have a good time.
Yeah,
and
totally.
That's probably not everybody's mentality, but like a lot of people that's sort of like, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's just sort of like where you're at. Like it's by no means wrong to have fun if like you're a recreational athlete, because like at the end of the day, like I don't think anybody there is like getting, their salary paid by working out. But yeah, it's cool to have like at a competition like this. I feel like there was much like a pretty solid depth of field, to be honest, like relative to a lot of the other competitions that I've done, just because I think they have a bigger pool that they're like, a much larger pool of athletes that they're drawing from, that because they have that qualifier. So it's like by the time it gets whittled down to the people who actually, have punched a ticket and then actually, sign on the dotted line to show up to the thing, it's people who are pretty committed at that point, which is, it's a much different feel than like showing up to a competition where it's like, the bottom half of the athletes are just sort of like doing whatever and like, like eating random stuff in between events, just like, doing like stuff that's like so amateur. It's like, obviously there's always going to be some of that stuff going on, but I feel like it was a lot of the races on both RX and pros, like there was a lot of tight races because of that.
Totally. And a lot of events that are coming down to a couple seconds, right?
Yeah. And that was probably one of my like big takeaways, was like when I sit back and think of the weekend, it was like there wasn't a crazy amount of like natural separation in a lot of the events. So it's like a matter of like who could hang on to unbroken versus breaking like once or twice. And that was like the difference between like first or second or like 14th, 15th,
Yeah. And it was like, for example, on the handstand push-up chest to bar, I felt like I was going for first place, ended up having to break once. That was 10th,
Yeah, exactly though. And it's like, so maybe we could start going through the workouts one by one, but, yeah, that one in particular, it was like So it was, well, why don't we just go through linear? We'll
Sure.
come back to that one.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
put a little pin in that.
Sure.
So day one was 2K row, 250 meter farmer's carry with like odd weight in each hand. It was 40-70 for us. And then a 2-ish mile run that was, felt a little bit longer than that. But yeah, somewhere around 2 mile mark. How did you felt like that one played out in person? We already
Totally.
mentioned like the weird running through the mud and like the actual course being pretty rough.
Mm-hmm.
But besides that,
I think that event one played into a broader theme for the weekend for me, which was having to balance going with your plan, right? Going with your plan in rehearsal versus racing in the moment,
yeah,
right? So when you look at that workout on paper, you think, okay, the row is a buy-in, right? It's going to be 7-8 minutes. And then there's a substantially long farmer carry and there's a 2 mile run, which is going to be well upwards of 10 minutes for most athletes, right? So my plan had been, row at a controlled pace, push the carry, and then make up ground on the run. But kind of what happened in the moment, right, is I come off towards the back of the pack on the row because I'm going with my plan, but couldn't really make up any ground on the run. There was a bunch of mud and dudes ran fast, right? Dudes rode fast and dudes ran fast. And so kind of my takeaway from that event was you can't always go with your plan. You can't always pace it. Sometimes you got to run the race when you're in the race, right?
yeah, and it's also like sometimes in an event like that where it's like, and maybe this is true for all events, but especially stuff that's like longer where there is a little bit more like willpower involved.
Yeah.
Like there's only so much willpower that's going to get you that extra strict handstand push up. Where
Yeah.
it's like running, that like the willpower matters a lot more. So it's
Yeah.
like an event like that. Yeah, it was like just kind of try not to lose too much time relative to the other competitors because neither of us are like 6'2" row masters here. So
We weren't going to be rowing a 650 like on that 2K.
no.
But there
No.
were, and it's important to note, there were probably 50 guys this weekend that rowed a sub 7.
Yeah, which there was a lot of people who rode really aggressively and then got off and either like immediately fell apart on the farmers carries or actually held on pretty well. And it was like impressive to see like how people put out like to start off like a 20+ minute effort with just like a 7-minute 2K. That was pretty wild to me, to be honest. Yeah. But I mean, besides that, like farmers carry just, I mean, it was basically just like if you didn't like lose time on there, it wasn't like you were gonna make up a lot of time. But I actually probably passed like 4 or 5 people just by just like one break, quick change, and it's just like speed walking the rest of the time. I think we both passed people in that section.
Yeah, my philosophy there was I'm just going to hold on to these dumbbells until they literally fall out of my hands.
Yeah.
And then at some point they did.
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't matter though because like the next part you don't need your hands.
Yeah.
So it's like you're just running. And it's also like if you go too hard on that first part, you can't really play the game in the second part. Like meaning that like if you do like race the row a little bit more, you probably aren't in the situation where you can really race the run. Where it's like you're just sort of like running at the pace that's like I won't blow up if I run at this pace.
Yep.
Where it's like if you treat the first part a little bit more conservatively, like we both did, we both thought we were gonna have probably more than we actually ended up having, but we thought we were gonna have a decent amount to like actually like try to catch people if they were out by us, and it kind of turned out where like neither of us really had in front or behind. There was not really competitors around us when we were crossing the line, so it's just sort of like, all right, we're just gonna stroll into the finish line.
Yeah, totally. I think that's something a skill that I realized I was missing in the moment during the event was not just running and knowing my own pace and fitness, but also looking ahead, seeing guys that are X number of yards away and thinking, is that person catchable? And if so, at what point do I turn on the jets to catch them?
Yep.
Right. That kind of in-person running strategy. I felt a little bit blind on how to handle that. Right.
Yeah. And that's one of those things that obviously, like you're saying, it comes with experience. And it's like, it's kind of like weighing, like I feel I know how I feel currently at this point in the race relative to how I expect to feel at this point in the race. Like
Yep.
for me, it was like I just ran through mud for the last 800 meters and my
Yeah.
legs are very, very tired. And
Yeah.
I was not like, I was expecting to be breathing hard, but like not like my legs just feeling like bricks. My
Yeah.
legs felt like bricks. And I was like, I'm going to try to catch these guys, but I can't push it too hard or I might fall apart and really
Yeah.
like implode. And it's
Yeah.
like, obviously you can't do that. And you need to be able to get to the point where like, if you do catch them, you can still run by them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's an
Yeah.
important part of it too. And just the way it turned out, I think for both of us, it was like, we ended up just more or less kind of like holding to the pace and just
Yeah.
sort of like coming across the line. And there was like really nobody on either side. And it's like at that point, and I think Brooke, my wife, said that she was like, yeah, like it didn't look like you were like running that hard when we got to the end. I was like, no, because like, why would I?
There was no one behind me. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I
that's
was
like one of
smiling
the,
across the finish line. Yeah.
yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, unless you do something like a Z score, you're always going to have that where it's like,
Yeah.
you're fighting for places, not for,
Time.
like time. Yeah. So
Totally.
very different than like training. We're
Right.
either trying to go off a certain effort or just do it as fast as you can, which is always interesting. Yeah. And that was day one for you. So how did you feel at the end of that event?
Yeah. I mean, definitely my legs were blown up. I think for me, that was my worst finish for the weekend by a long shot. And
Yeah.
so I knew that I had some ground to make up, right, on Saturday. But I also knew that Saturday were great events for me. Those were going to be some of my best events. And so obviously went to sleep with a little bit of like execution nerves, right? In the sense of I know what I'm capable of. I just have to do it, right?
Yeah.
Rather than let's go out there and find out, right? Because these were all workouts I had rehearsed, and so kind of had numbers in my head and knew that I needed to hit them, right?
Yeah. That's the other thing is like most of the workouts, except the final, were announced and we did variations or like full run throughs of them to really get a good idea. So I feel like we all had a pretty good barometer, with the exception of like what ended up being like the morning 2 event back-to-back one, which I think caught a lot of people off guard. So that one was the first, well, technically event 2 for Sam, because I had to showcase. Well, let me go over that one quick and then we'll come back.
Please.
We'll jump all around, so bear with us. But so the pro division had what they called a pro showcase, which was a 3-part event, which ended up being basically like an A, B, and C. They put it in competition corner, each as its own event, but it's like weighted for 33 points. It's like the highest, like essentially like 100-point win. So it was like a max handstand hold from 0 to 3 minutes unbroken, like
Triples.
finding a max handstand hold in that time, I should say.
Yep.
And then max triple unders, cumulative across the next 3-minute window, and then a final 3-minute window to establish max unbroken ring muscle ups. So I really like the structuring of the event. I think that it's cool to do things that are novel and different like that, especially if you don't weight them as crazy and you do like an aggregate score like they did. One of the things that was different was I expected to do fairly well on that because we've been doing like a ton of like handstand holds and I've always been good at ring muscle ups. And I always liked jump rope stuff. So I was like, I knew I could do okay at all of them, but I'd never done triple unders until like they actually announced this. So I was like, well, I got to practice those. And like in my practice, I was figuring this out and I had been messaging them and like trying to strategize, well, how am I obviously going to get my best score on this? And it's like, I could potentially like sit out the triple under one and just go like for a big set and get like, 95 or 100 points on like a handstand hold, and then hopefully get like 95 or 100 points on like the ring muscle up. And then like, okay, if I don't get really any triple unders or just do a few to try to like go jump a few guys who don't get any sort of thing, hopefully it ends up shaking out really well. And it turned out where they actually inputted the scores differently than I thought. Like they inputted as 3 unique events, each being weighted 33 points versus it being basically an average of 3 different events going in as a single 100-point score, which is what I thought was going to happen. Yeah. So I was a little bit butthurt about that because I thought I was going to potentially win that whole event, and I ended up only like winning the 3rd part. But it ended up obviously sort of being a wash, and there's like a lot of people. I don't know if I actually would have won that event or not at this point, but it was definitely like there's little things like that, like where inputting of scores and like how they're actually doing like the weighting system and things that like can actually make a really big difference at the end of a weekend like that.
Totally. And I think one other thing to flag from that event is, Ben, you and I had done some research in the past on max handstand hold benchmarks and what we thought guys might be able to hit looking at the age group. I believe it was semis a year or
Yeah.
two ago.
Yep.
And guys there were hitting, roughly in the 30 to 60 second window was kind of like a semis level score. And one thing that
Yeah.
surprised me is from this past weekend at TFX, pro men field, maybe comparable to age group semis, right, was that all the top guys were well over a minute, right, approaching 90 seconds. Field is really elevating on that particular movement.
Yeah, and it was also interesting. I haven't looked in at the individual scores yet, but one of the things that we saw with when we did that research before on the semis, age group semis, was that it was like, above 60 or 50 seconds was like a big break point. And it was like that break point where you kind of get past the critical mass of like competitors for this was like well above a minute.
Yeah, totally.
Like maybe like right around where I was, there was like there was once or twice like right around after the 60-second mark where I like almost fell, and like everyone was still up around me. I could you're not really looking around, but in like your periphery you can kind of see it and sense it. Yeah. And like everybody was still up at that point, and I like saved it once or twice more and like came down at like 116. I ended up being a top like I think 6 finish or something like that.
Yeah.
So there was just like so many bodies in there. Yeah.
It's kind of like, a 120 handstand hold is kind of like a 20 ring muscle up mark, right?
That's a great way to think about it. It's because it was the same thing on the ring muscle up. It was like all these bodies were stacked up right around like the
16 to 18. Everyone's in there.
Yeah, 16 to 18, 19 range. There's a lot of people because again, that wasn't completely fresh. A little bit of fatigue from triple unders, a little bit of tricep stuff from handstand holds. So, it was interesting to see. I liked it. Besides thinking it was going to be scored differently than it was, I really liked that event. And I think it was still executed well. So I again, games have done that where they've done like a skill medley and then have some sort of an aggregate score, which is, I think, a really cool way to do it.
Yep, I agree.
Sweet. Let's move on to day 2. You want to like describe the back-to-back event?
Sure. So there were 2 events back-to-back, each with an 8-minute time cap and with a 4-minute rest in between. So if you finish the first event under the cap, you get a little more rest. First event was inverse, which was 2 couplets, one with chest to bar and increasing weight dumbbell snatch, the other with deficit handstand push-up and increasing weight dumbbell snatch. And really what it was an unbroken gymnastics race, right? Unbroken chest to bar and then unbroken deficit handstand push-up with what were ultimately irrelevant dumbbells in between. And then the second event was heavy sandbag squats in a ladder format, ascending and then descending back, alternating with a heavy jump rope. So what was interesting about the first event was, I think, for really any guy in, call it, the top half of the RX men's field and pro too, it was effectively a sprint, right? So every guy was coming in under 5 minutes, right? And so the question was, can you go unbroken on those 30 deficit handstand push-ups or the 3 sets of 10, right? So I think a kind of interesting takeaway for me from a training perspective from that event was the balance between kind of focusing on one's own fitness and pace and replicating what you've done in training versus keeping an eye on the guys around you and actually racing, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're walking back and forth to the dumbbell and the pull-up bar, when you're upside down doing deficit handstand push-ups, it's basically impossible to know where the other guys are, right? But that event came down to a couple seconds, right? So in hindsight, I think about, if I had known that other guys were right next to me, could I have transitioned a little faster? Could I have kicked up on the wall a little faster, right? Those are the kind of things I'm thinking about when I reflect on what could have taken me from like a 10th to a second, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like the only time that you really got a feel for where the field was at was as you were coming off like your handstand push-up or like your pull-up bar and like walking towards your dumbbells or running towards the dumbbells, you could kind of get an idea of where like the other competitors were, if they're already at the dumbbell versus, you're kind of like running there with them, whatever. So like, it was very much felt like it all came down to the last set of handstand push-ups for a lot of, top half RX probably and
most of the pro,
top like 2/3 of pro, because there's still even people in pro who are worse at handstand push-ups than people in RX. It's just what other skills they have. Like there's a bunch of like long limbed tall guys who just really struggled on that because Yeah, makes sense. Obvious reasons. So yeah, it was like for me when I came off that wall for the second set of after the second set of handstand push-ups, it was like 2/3 of the field was either moving to the dumbbell or on that last or second to last dumbbell.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh boy, I better do this last set unbroken. And luckily, like I was able to squeak it out, and I probably didn't have one more rep in the tank, but then like that bumped me up. Like I passed 2/3 of those guys in that window, and that's what made the difference there.
Yep. And I had the opposite experience where I couldn't lock out the last 1 inch of my triceps on the final rep. Had to kick down, and I mean, only 1 or 2 guys got me in my heat, but it was good for 10th. Even though I started the workout, I was in dead last.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's a good example of how the little details like that over the course of a weekend, if you like are on the good side of a few of those, it really jumps you up. Whereas if like you have a few errors like that, it'll kind of spirals and obviously go the other way as well.
Now, we ultimately learned that workout was partially a test in and of itself and partially just pre-fatiguing us for the next event, right?
Yeah, you had mentioned how like the dumbbells were irrelevant, and they really were for that test. Yes. But I think they impacted the next part more, which, again, each of those on its own, they're each fine tests. But actually, like, rarely do I like the back-to-back format. Yep. But I think this one was executed really well because the first workout wasn't so much general fatigue that it like prevented people from like doing anything well in the second part, which happens a lot of times. Or like you just have to pick one. Like that's always like not a great thing either in competitions where it's like, oh, like you can. I remember there's a games workout. It was like I think it was called Ringer 1 and Ringer 2, and it was like 30, 20, 10 couplets or something along those lines. And it's like James Newberry went out and just hammered the first 30 cals of the bike, and he like won the event and got like a bunch of publicity for it, which is like good for him. But it was like you had to pick one. Like you could either do well in the first one or you could do well in the second. Where it was like I like this back to back where it was like they were contingent on each other and they mattered, and the general fatigue buildup did have an impact on the second part quite a bit, but it wasn't so much like metabolic fatigue from the first part, just like systemic, that people were just like completely trash for the second part. However, it definitely was impacted. The single unders were with a climbing rope that was cut off to like a jump rope length, and then it was sandbag squats 9 12 15 12 9 with those 30 single unders before each set, and a lot of people did fall apart on that.
About over half of the men's RX field did not finish that workout in the timeout.
Honestly, it was pretty devastating to watch people. Like people didn't
carnage.
Yeah, like people didn't look ruined going into the event. Yeah, like they didn't look tired when they were starting. Yeah, but people just fell apart. Yeah, it was crazy to see. Actually, I mean, even in the pro field, there was a lot of guys who just like imploded on that. Which it's like it's 150 pounds. Like you should be able to continue to move it, but it was just like for whatever reason. The combination of like that little bit of systemic fatigue, a little bit of tricep, it's like enough to like make the jump roping tough, and then also like it was like your legs and butt and back were just so blown up from the sandbag that like that combination just made that like jump rope and then into your next set of squats just like people just fell apart. Yeah.
Totally. I think that one definitely felt. What I liked about that test is that it felt like a true fitness test, right? In that, sure, the weight mattered a little bit, right, on the back. Sure, the skill mattered a little bit on the rope, right? But when I didn't want to pick up that jump rope, it was because I felt like I couldn't jump because my heart was going 200 beats per minute, right? That was the limiter, right? Which I liked.
Yeah, I would agree. It was definitely you had to will your way through that one. There's no hiding from it.
I mean, I kind of said to myself going into it, I am not putting down this sandbag until it drops me, Unfortunately, it did drop me by the end. But,
There's a great video somewhere of Sam rolling around in the dirt in pain.
Yeah. That was a tough one.
So for you had this big break in the middle of the day, like many hours off in between your back-to-back and the next one, which was snatch and go. And for me, it was a very tight window. Like maybe like 90 minutes between events, but less than that when you actually like include warming up for your next event and like flushing out from the previous one.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people, and I think this is maybe a good example of where like something like the games, this would be a very different situation. And obviously that could be, extrapolated to a lot of different things, but the professionalism and like warm-ups and cool downs and like how people treat themselves in things like that, where it's like you just got buried by a workout, you're going to have to turn around and have another high output event in 90 minutes. Like, what are you doing in that time? That's where like a lot of people, it's like, oh, my legs are trash. And they kind of like sit around for like 45 minutes and they realize, oh, I got like 25 minutes till I go, I better walk over there. And it's like, by the time they do it, they're like not primed and ready to go for their next event.
Totally.
Yep. But for you had a nice long break. So take us through Snatch and Go. What was the workout and what was your experience with it?
Yeah, totally. So it was 3 2-minute intervals with a 1-minute rest in between, beginning with a 250-meter run on a kind of track. And in the remaining time of the 2-minute interval, max snatches for pro guys, it was 185. For RX guys, it was 165. I think the way the event was designed with both the 185 and the 165 bars was it really wasn't a touch and go event, except for maybe one or two guys, right? It was kind of a repeatability, capacity, power output endurance test, right? And the run was also short enough that every guy was coming through sort of in the window of, call it 42 to 52 seconds, right? And so, that maybe is the difference of 1 or 2 reps. So I had much longer to prepare, so I could rest, I could eat, I could stretch, I could flush, and then I could do a full snatch warm up. I built to a 205 power snatch, right, to get the power going. And then I could do some strides in the parking lot, getting the running going. So can't say I felt great going into that event, just from a cortisol perspective, but all was good there. And then I think for me, just execution wise, like it was a good event for me. I think I'm pretty enduring on those like medium weight barbells. So I was kind of consistent across the 3 rounds. But if you look at the guys who won, at least in RX men, they really came out with a massive set, call it 18 reps or 19 reps. And even though they fell off a little bit, right, they went 18, 14, 12, that first set was enough to hold them over. Whereas if it had been more rounds, you could imagine some of the smaller guys could have caught up, right?
Yeah. And maybe if like I imagine what it'd be like to be like a super strong, powerful guy, because I'm not all that.
Your fantasy.
Yeah. It's like, just pretend it's like at a lower percentage. It's like 135 pound bar. It's like, that's kind of like how you do strategize it. You like go out and you would do like a much bigger set, and then you do like singles when you're a little bit more fatigued and just try to keep the cycle speed up.
Totally.
Where it's like, if it's a bar where if you get too much fatigue, you're going to get buried by it. Like 185 is for me. Like it's a very repeatable weight for me to power snatch. But at the same time, if I get too much fatigue, I will miss that bar. So it's one of those where like, I think for both of us, it made more sense to try to do fast singles with a consistent run. And we kind of mentioned this. It was like, yes, it was a running and a snatching event, but it felt very much so biased to the barbell, where like you could be a big guy. It wouldn't really impact you to run a little bit slower. And then when you get to the bar, you can just rip it and get a lot more reps.
Yep. I think there was a good amount of kind of rehearsal, strategy, timing there as well, where in most of the events this weekend, actually, I felt that we couldn't see the clock, or the clock was just somewhere, that was inconvenient to look at, for example. And so you don't know, do you have 20 seconds left? Do you have 9 seconds left, right? And kind of pacing out how many more reps you think you're going to attempt, and whether to go for one more, or whether that one more that you're going for is going to be after the buzzer and be wasted energy, right?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, like, if you get, we were saying this, like you can snatch in 3 seconds. So it's like 3, 2, 1. It's like you hear them counting down and you grab it one last time. It's like those 3 extra reps is like you just jumped a third of the field maybe.
Yeah,
so
totally.
That was one of the things, like there was really never a clock that I could see that was like a convenient spot where you could just look over and see it.
Yeah,
like
totally.
That never happened. So it was really interesting that it was like obviously some of the events it doesn't matter because you're just racing your opponents and trying to be strategic that way. But something like for example, if someone didn't wear a watch or anything on them
Yep.
when they were running, they might not have any clue how far they're into the
Yep.
run. Where at least we kind of try to navigate that and
Watch.
have an idea with like how deep you're. 8 minutes into this run, I probably am like I have another mile to go here. Like
Totally.
simple things like that. But like that snatch and go one, the clock matters a lot. So
Yeah.
it's like if you knew you had 15 seconds and you can get 3 more reps in versus you still have 30 seconds. I need to like take another breath in between these singles. You don't know that. You just kind of have to go off your gut and try to keep moving. And then
Yep.
when you hear the countdown, try to make an audible and go for it the last minute or the last second.
Absolutely. And I think maybe one other kind of competing lesson that I got from that event was I noticed in the briefing, they told us very clearly, if you starfish your power snatch, your feet have to come back under your hips. You need to move the hips. But I'm a pretty big starfisher on a power snatch, and my judge was being very lenient, right?
Yeah.
Letting me kind of lock out the hips, but not walk the feet in. And so I just took complete advantage of that. And I saved, I probably got 2-3 extra reps on the event just from that, you taking advantage of the judge that I had.
Yeah. And that's very true. It's like they tell you one thing in the back, you go out and you talk to your judge. And again, this maybe this is the organization at fault. Maybe this is just the
Random
nature of
chance,
things.
whatever.
Yeah, random chance or whatever. I mean, bottom line is I guess if it was maybe better communicated, it would have been more congruent across. But yeah, I mean I can't fault them. I think their systems were fairly good for the most part. But there was definitely differences between like when you got briefed in the back versus the night before versus when you actually got out there with your judge as to what. And it was like, you can drop the bar from overhead. Well, you actually have to control it. You can't drop it. And it's like that's the difference in the workout, whether you're 5th or 15th in that workout.
Yeah.
So it's like little things like that make a huge difference. So like figuring out as an athlete, like how can I try to game this where it's like I'm meeting the standard, but like no more, and I don't waste any extra energy. So it's like the way I try to do that was like I'll keep my hands on the bar as it goes down, and I'll just kind of like deaden the bounce of my barbell and like reset my hands and then go into my next rep. But by the end of it, you realize that your judge isn't giving you any like even like looks like, oh, I could no rep you, but like they're just giving you everything. So it's like, okay, just drop it normal by the end, and it doesn't make any difference. But it's like figuring out like where if your judge is able to give you some leniency or not, which is like it's tough. It's actually much easier to do that when you have an in-person judge like that versus like one of the penalties that you're getting online, which is another thing that we had talked about was like, man, if you get a penalty online, it's like if you were in person and you did that, it would be like, hey, stand up all the way. And it's like they give you one no rep and you self-corrected and it took you 3 seconds and that was it for your workout. Where it's like, obviously like the online format, people can get sometimes rightfully screwed and other times, like it would have been a correction that they would have made like on the fly and not been impacted near as much.
Absolutely agree.
So that was day 2. And then, the last 2 events on day 3 started off with Atlas. I believe these were the same weights for both of us, which was it's basically an EMOM of a basically a clean and 2 jerks. So from the floor, 2 jerks. It went 185, 215, 235, 255, 275, 295, 315, 335. And then if you made it through all that, you could call your shot, meaning that you could choose what weight you wanted to put onto the barbell and have like one final complex lift. How'd you feel like that one played out?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, from a personal execution and just chatting with guys in the back as well, I think everyone going into that event knows the bar that they have 100% chance on, and then the bar where the probability is above 0 but below 100%. Right? So everyone knows where that bar is, and so it's kind of managing fatigue and efficiency before that. And I think one thing that I was really thinking about was pacing and ep of every bar look the same, right, going into that event. Where I would, come up, squat clean, 2 split jerks, immediately chalk for the next bar and sit and rest for 45 seconds, right? I noticed watching that event that there were a lot of guys that were kind of standing around, moving their bar around, jumping around, looking in the crowd and waving during their imam, right? And you kind of lose a lot of energy doing that, right? um, one thing I'll mention that was really interesting about this event is that there's going to be a big bunch up of guys around 295, right before and right after it, right? Just given the ability of the field. In the back, they briefed us that if you miss a lift, the tie break will be the number of cleans. So if you fail, let's say you fail 315, right, but you got 295, if you clean 315 a couple times in the minute, right, that will count towards your tie break. What they didn't tell us, and ended up being how they scored the event, was that one jerk would count towards your score, right? So one jerk and one clean would be, and then a missed jerk, right, would be worth more than 5 cleans, right? So it ended up being to your advantage to actually have hit one of the jerks, right? So even though I ended up missing my second jerk because I had jerked it once and then cleaned it after that, I got the highest score of any guy that missed 315. And thus, even if I had hit 315, I would have had like the same placing in the event, which is very strange.
Yeah, it's always funny to see like there's certain events where like the tie break, it's like, why is it there?
Yeah.
Like almost irrelevant, and at least like for an athlete to think about and like go after as like a target. Whereas like there's other ones that's like, there's gonna be so many people here that like this is gonna make or break your workout if you like do the tie break correctly or not.
Yeah, totally.
Especially in online formats. But yeah, that one definitely mattered a lot, just by the way it seemed like they designed the ladder so that so many people could do it, that by the nature of it, it got really aggressive really quickly for like everybody at the same time, or a lot of people at the same time. So yeah, everyone was just stacked up at like 3 bars for a lot of the RX and Pro guys.
And just thinking to some things that are hard to replicate in training, right? One thing that I hadn't thought about was, they give you a mat that you do your lift on, and if you step off the mat, it's a no rep, right? So I tend to save my jerks forward a little bit, right? And so I kind of realized during the event, like, wow, this is kind of less space than I usually give myself to clean the jerk, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one thing. Or another thing that's hard to replicate in training is having multiple bars set up, right, and not having to change the weight yourself, right? So it's kind of interesting to get to experience all that.
Yeah, and there's some things that are more or less practical to do in training, like. Even like there'll be times where I like have people and I make them lift on the platforms here and say like, if you step off the platform, it's a no rep or whatever. Simple things like that. But obviously it's not stuff you need to do all the time in training, because if you're strong enough, you'll just do it. But it's also just a matter of like knowing what you need to focus on so that you can actually like execute and not make like a little error like that like makes a huge difference in your weekend.
Totally. But overall, I mean, look, like lifting outside under the blue sky, on a sunny day with a crowd. I mean, it was a fun event. Like I enjoyed it. Yeah.
It was the only thing that was kind of sketchy for me on that was my lifters are sort of like smooth on the bottom, and I had all this dirt on my shoes from like walking through like literally the dirt. It's like a rodeo. And it was very sketchy the first split jerk I did. That was like my foot was like sliding out, so I had to keep like scraping like the bottom of like a basketball player's like always like rubbing their hands on the bottom of their shoes. That's what I was trying to do. But that was a fun event.
Yeah.
And the last one for me was 6 rope climbs. It was 4 times. So it was basically like it was an interesting format because it wasn't really a chipper per se, but it was 6 rope climbs, and then you like lunged with 70 per hand to a box, like 20 feet, so not a long distance. 10 burpee box jump overs, lunge back to the rig area where you do 12 bar muscle ups, lunge back to the box, 12 burpee box jump overs, lunge back to the rig one more time, 24 toes to bar. So quick workout, not any room for error. It was basically like who could go unbroken. And the one thing so this is the final. They didn't announce it until the day of the final. The thing that in hindsight was really interesting, I think movement wise, it rounded out some things in a really helpful way. Like we didn't do like burpees or box jumps or obviously like some of those specific hanging gymnastics movements already. But in terms of like time domain, I think it then started to skew it a little bit. It was probably, I think besides the showcase,
A
which
little
you
under
probably don't
5
count.
minutes.
Yeah, it was like, I think like like 4.5 maybe ish minutes to finish that. So it was like, we then had, I think, four workouts that had 8-minute caps. Because the snatch and go also was an 8-minute window. 2 of those were rest, but and then it was, I mean, what those workouts themselves ended up being a little bit varied in their time domain, but a lot of them were still like in that 4 to 6 minutes. So it's like a lot of like that, like kind of power endurance sort of window where it's like you have to go out really hard and hang on to it. And it was less about like the volume separating people and more about like a specific quality breaking down. And if you're not able to hold unbroken because that thing like gave up pretty much, then it was like you won't be successful. So it's like the inverse one was like the handstand push-up. If you couldn't do all the 33 sets of 10 deficit handstand push-ups unbroken, that was your workout. It was like the sandbag. If you had to break that, that was your workout. If it was, and the last one was like, if your grip blew up and you couldn't do the last set of toes to bar unbroken, you lost 3-4 places. It was very much like, if you don't have this, you're going to be bad off. Versus like other competitions and even like a lot of the qualifiers we see, like the volume is sort of used to separate people, where it's like, if you're not able to keep smart sets the whole way through and kind of mitigate your fatigue, that's what's going to be the biggest separator. So I didn't feel like there was a gymnastics test that was a volume separator for anyone. It was more like intensity, density, like could you hold on, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, you usually see in quarterfinals, if not even the open, right? You see like that 13 to 18 minute kind of time domain, something with a good amount of volume, whether it's GHDs or rowing or something. And we had the really long event day one, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah, very true. It was and I don't know if that's design or if they just look at like trying to create like a variety of like movements, and then like the length of those things or what they end up being is maybe different than what they thought. I don't know if it's just different than they thought or if they were just okay with the fact that like a lot of them are in that time domain. But it was very interesting because what the pros got for their final is very different than what RX got. So the pros, like I just described, it was MGW, monostructural gymnastics weightlifting. But like the dumbbells weren't that big of a separator where it was like, it would just been weightlifting and gymnastics. Sorry. No cyclical. Unless you count like a Peru box jump over. But my point being the RX got a bike. It was like, I think it was Fringe Sport bike or something. The Raptor bike, they call it. And it was like 25 cals to start and end that. I actually didn't get to watch the RX guys. But like it seemed like, and Sam, you can give us your opinion of this. It seemed like that really skewed like the final results of RX in particular, was that like a lot of like the really big guys who are just really powerful could rip through the cals in the bike and like just kind of like slog their way through the rest of the stuff, where it was like that was the biggest separator.
Yeah, I mean, you could have. It was one of those events where you could have sorted guys by height, and that would have been your finish order on that finale.
Yeah,
and it was just looking at the rankings of RX and watching that finale. There were some guys that were your typical kind of CrossFit size, maybe even smaller. You know, guys in the kind of 5'7" to 5'9" range, who were high on the leaderboard going into that finale, and then they watch big guys around them do 25 cals in sub 20 seconds, try to keep up. And these guys start falling apart, like guys failing bar muscle ups, right? Because they went out at probably 1400 watts on the bike, and that's what you had to do in that workout, right? So it was a very strange finale, if you ask me.
Yeah. And it was also, I mean, I just, so like for the most part, except the pro showcase, it was like the pro and RX programming were aligned.
Same weight, same distance, everything.
Same weight, pretty much. Like, very little changes. That seemed like a really big change to me. And I don't know why that was the case. I'm glad I didn't have the bike, to be honest.
Yeah.
But
and not to mention the amount of pain it caused those poor guys.
Yeah. We were also kind of saying this from like a spectator's point of view. Like, I think sometimes people are like, oh, this is going to be super gross. It'll be great. And it's usually the opposite. Like, oh, this is
Yep,
super gross. It's not that fun to watch.
I agree. Like you're just waiting for the judge to put up their hand. It's not that fun to. You can't really see the race on the bike, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I definitely like the use of monostructural and even like machines in competitions, but
Sure.
I think you can do it in a way that it doesn't need to interfere with the spectacle.
Yeah.
Like, you should still be able to see the race unfold, even if there's like a stretch of work on a machine.
You could have started it on the bike and then ended it not on the bike,
Yeah,
end it with soda bar.
yeah, exactly. Something else where you can have it visually.
Yep.
Yeah, but overall, I mean, I had a really good experience. It was cool to be in a more competitive field than I have been up to this point, and definitely a lot of like learnings and yeah, just experience that I felt like was super helpful for myself. But then like for me, I'm always enjoying like being able to like pass on knowledge to other people. So like I hope that the more of this kind of thing I do, I can continue to like pass on that on. Um, Sam, like what were your any big picture like learnings or takeaways so far?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this was my first, in-person, multi-day qualifier required competition, and there was a lot of managing game day stuff that required some thought, right, around food, outfits, body heat management because it was a cold, rainy day, changes of shoes, changes of clothes, hydration, bathroom timing, warm up timing, flush timing, all of that stuff that obviously we have some familiarity with from the intensity of the training that's required to be at that level to even show up to that competition. But over 3 days and in a new environment, I think there was just a lot of kind of planning and foresight required that was mentally exhausting, frankly, almost as exhausting as the events themselves, right? But coming away from it, I feel happy and motivated, and like I want to do more of these for sure.
Yeah, very good points. And I think also it's like all amplified when you have to fly. Like
Yeah, yeah,
it's not like it's even if it's you know 4 hours away and you gotta drive to it. It's like it's just different than the fact that you just can't throw everything you want in your car and just go.
yep, yep,
Um,
totally.
or like if it's like training, it's like oh like I'll just go grab this thing that I forgot, and it's like you can't do that if you flew there. Or like for us, it was like our Airbnb was super nice, but it wasn't that close to the venue, so it wasn't like practical for us to like go back in between events and things. Which is
Totally.
like obviously if you were at like a hotel that would have been really close, that would have been convenient that you could have went back and gotten in the quiet and the warm and like
Yep.
showered or like gotten whatever you needed in between events from that perspective. But then it's like the kitchen situation would have been a wreck,
Yeah.
like because like
Yeah.
you're gonna have to like have all cold meals or you're gonna have to eat out every meal, like figuring that out. All of those things are like logistics that are because it's just like so far from what you normally do in your day to day. It's all that stuff's super stressful and it matters a lot.
And I think there are ways to prep for that, right? Where when we did the TFX simulation over 2 or 3 days, I was prepping like game day nutrition, right? I was like, I'm gonna drink my Gatorade like I will on game day. I'm gonna have meals like I do on game day, snacks in between events like I do on game day, and I think that helped, right? And now all of those drinks and snacks I had leading up to the comp, I never want to eat or drink again. Yeah.
Yeah, we were just laughing about this. Neither of us want to see a PB&J for a long time.
No, please no.
I don't need any more Gatorade powder. Yeah.
No, but I mean, I think like my big takeaway, right, is, and this can apply for anyone doing the open and or quarters or big events like this, is we all know when you're going into an event, whether you're playing to win or you're playing not to lose, right? And so for some of these events, I absolutely was playing to win, and I'll admit, for a couple of them, I was playing not to lose, right? So as I progress as an athlete, like more and more playing to win is what we want, right?
Yeah. Very well said. Sam, thanks for doing this, man.
It's been good, Ben. Thanks, man. Looking forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.